What's up, free folks? I'm Freedom Rain, and today we're going to do some reactions. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so one of the first videos we're going to get into is from Zach, White Privilege from an Asian Perspective. Now, this video was done in 2018. It was sent to me recently. It's my first time seeing it, and I think it's really worth talking about, especially in the context of what's going on in the nation with Black Lives Matter, with white supremacy, and with the Asian hate crime that was on the rise. So let's get into this video.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Zach here.
Hi, Zach.
Back with another video for all of you today. Thank you for tuning into my channel. Be sure to subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and comment on this video when you are done watching it. And be sure to join the Discord discussion. There'll be a link to my Discord server in the video description below, and that will be a place where you can express your thoughts, your opinions, and expand on a lot of the topics and the ideas that I talk about in my videos. So just a little bit of an update before I get into today's topic. And it's probably worth addressing this topic once and for all. White privilege. I cannot believe it is 2018 and people are still talking about white privilege.
Right.
This is going to come from the perspective of an Asian American guy in America, or I should just say an Asian person in America. Okay? Now, I've seen a lot of people talk about white privilege. I mean, a lot of black people have talked about white privilege. A lot of white people have talked about talked about white privilege. I've yet to see a lot of Asians speaking up about white privilege. We simply just don't do it, people. Have you ever talked to an Asian person realistically about white privilege? Not from the context that they've endured prejudice or discrimination by whites because they were called Ching Chang Chong or all that kind of stuff, but real white privilege from a socioeconomic status. You ever heard of it from an Asian? Have you ever heard an East Asian or an Indian talk about white privilege? I'm guessing probably not, or probably not as commonly as you would hear other minorities complain about white privilege. It simply doesn't exist. It is just one of those things that have been fed to you for the longest time by progressive liberals and a lot of people on the left to keep you exactly where you are and to feel like you are part of this group identity that you can't get ahead in America.
Okay, let's pause real quick. Part of what he's saying is true. Part of what people need to understand is that the left liberal media often does wrap this up in a narrative that makes minorities and people of color feel powerless, and it keeps them from addressing the root causes by trying to blame the systematic disparities on individuals in the streets, like walking up to any random white person and being able to say, hey, the reason I can't move forward in this country is because of you personally. Right, so it's important to realize that, because even though I feel like, I feel like he may be about to bring up some very common conservative talking points just by the way he's starting. We still have to be able to acknowledge the truth is that the left liberal media and the right, everybody's playing these identity politic culture war issues, right? So on one side it's, oh, white people, conservatives, you're censored, you're so oppressed, and you're being blamed for everything. And then for the people of color, it's, oh, you're so oppressed, no matter what you do, you won't be able to get out of these holes, you're hopeless, people holding you back. So by the way he's starting, I'm assuming that he is a conservative or has conservative viewpoints, because he's fitting those two narratives perfectly in juxtaposition to each other. Let's continue.
That you can't make something of yourself. That race and that whites have an unfair racial advantage, economically, socially, that will prevent you from getting ahead because they hold all the power in America. They hold all the cards. And shit, if you're black or you're a minority or, you're a Native American, you are just out of luck and you can't get anywhere.
So let's pause right there. That's an important distinction to make, because I hear this narrative being pushed a lot, and honestly, from my experience growing up in the hood and growing up in poor neighborhoods surrounded by people of color, I have definitely heard people complain that the deck is stacked unfairly against them. I hear them saying things about the white power structure that disadvantages colored people historically and how that continues to this day. But to be fair, in my experience, I've never heard a parent in the hood tell a kid, you cannot do anything, you're screwed. That is the opposite of what every parent tells them. Now, to confirm some of the things he's saying, I often hear families of color bring up that there is racism and you need to watch out for it. You need to do this, this, and that. Everybody's had the talk about police, what to do when police are stopping you or treating you what you think is unfairly. But I've never heard any parent tell the kids that no matter what you do, you're screwed. There's no moving forward. If anything, my parents told me, and a lot of parents say, son, you may have to try twice as hard as other people. You may have to, persist. You may have to not give up. So if anything, what he's talking about ends up being a prep talk in the community to get people prepared to face even more challenges. Again, if he's saying, if he and other conservatives are saying that inadvertently, by them mentioning racism facing the kids, if they're saying that may create a sense of dread and hesitancy and maybe make them feel unconfident, then there might be some truth to that, and we should look honestly at that. Even if we're having that talk with kids, for example, when your parents say, if a cop pulls you over, please, remain calm, keep your hands visible, don't fight back, fight back in the court, don't fight in the streets. Like, these are talks that all young black people have. If having that talk, you think you're preparing your kid, but what it's secretly doing is making your kid more nervous of police, I think that's something we can talk about, but let's continue.
I'm here to talk about that, and I'm here to clarify once and for all why it is not true.
I'm sorry, I want to let him get through this, but the other thing is I see a lot of these young conservatives who are maybe 25, 30 years old, and they think that in their short lifetime, they have solved it. They have solved the simple equation of why, you know what I mean? And they come with this confidence. I think it's really important to recognize and check your arrogance and say, this is my strong opinion, but this single person shouldn't be able to debunk this in their lifetime when this has been going on far before. So let's continue.
It has everything to do with choice. It has everything to do with culture and environmental conditioning than it has to do with race. We all have equal opportunities here in America, and in fact, for a lot of minorities out there, there are already affirmative action plans in place that help you get jobs and help you get into college. So the fact that we are still whining about the concept of white privilege, to me, is honestly sickening. Because it's not, number one, based in any facts, and number two, it's just victim mentality at the end of the day.
Okay.
For a lot of you...
Sorry, time out. He said that white privilege isn't based on any facts. So this is a common narrative on the conservative that white privilege is a myth. So here's what can be true and can be false about this, because of course, me being the man in the middle, I'm here to break down all these one-sided narratives that you may hear. It is true that if you're looking for laws and policies that are worded specifically racistly, that are dividing and keeping people held out, good luck finding them since the 1960s, especially after the Civil Rights Act. But for him to say that in America there is no history of white privilege or white supremacy, it just shows that it shows where you're coming from, because you can easily point out from the mid 1800s all the way to the early 1900s that there were very many laws that benefited white people. You must see that it is not a myth. It happened. Certain people were advantaged, other people weren't. There's clear indications. It's on the books. We know that this happened. To give him the benefit of the doubt and to assume positive intent, I think what he's saying is that since the Civil Rights Act, all of the white privilege laws and discriminatory laws that held specific races back have been disbanded. And there could be somewhat a case for that. So I'm going to assume that's what he means. I'm going to assume he doesn't mean that it's a complete myth and people of color just have been making manifest destiny and white supremacy ideology up for the last 500 years. When we have many scholars, European scholars, who are quoted. So it did exist. It was strong, and it was one of the founding bases of why this country was what it was. If you want the definition of white supremacy, here it is. All right, so white supremacy and white privilege did exist. So we're clear on that, everybody, right? Conservatives, liberals, we're clear that in early American history that did exist, right? Systematic institutional slavery. So I think what he's going to say, which is what most people on the far right do, is that sure, it happened, but after 1964 it's null and void. It ceased to exist. I hope that's what he's going to say, or else this guy needs to do more research.
For a lot of you viewers who have been watching my videos for some time now already know my stance on it, okay? I am tired of the victim mentality, and I am tired of people blaming white people for all of their problems.
He's fed up.
Yeah, white people have done a lot of, have been responsible for discrimination against minorities historically. But in these days...
Just discrimination? Okay, we'll ride with that.
These days, ever since the 60s, after the Civil Rights Act, after the Equal Pay Act, after equal employment, and, all of these opportunities came about for everybody, it's no longer a problem.
Okay, let's pause right there, because what he's saying is kind of what I was hoping he'd say, and what I was thinking he'd say is that he's admitting that white people have done a lot of discrimination. Of course, that's a very light and loose term for what really happened from the 1950s all the way to the 1500s, as far as on the global scene. But what he's saying now is that once all of those things passed, the country is much more fair. I think we need to pause right here and let's just be honest. White people that he's talking about here didn't suddenly decide to say, hey, let's just be super fair, pass civil rights, pass equal pay, pass this. You have to understand that mainly black people and a lot of white people also joined in, but mainly the road to get those rights were mainly on the backs of black people. Black people were beaten, arrested, kept in jail, police brutality, had dogs sicked on them, hit with water hoses, crosses burning in their front yards, lynchings, oh so many lynchings, leaders who step up and speak out and have been rallying for this change for years. It's not like they just said, hey, civil rights, and the government say, yeah. As far back as Medgar Evers, when he was killed, people have been rallying for this. So let's stop pretending like the American or any oppressive or any oppressor is just going to give rights freely. My ancestors fought very hard for those rights, and they benefit everybody, including Asians. So I think we just need to be really clear about that. It's not say, oh, things were so racist into the 60s where they just quit. People were fighting long and hard for that suffrage. So let's just put that point out there.
When we think about affluence in America, this is something that has been brought up by a lot of political commentators and a lot of personalities on the internet. People have written about it in the Huffington Post. It is not something that is a well-kept secret. I mean, hell, you could Wikipedia this and find this out. Asians are among the most affluent households by race per capita in the United States. That is no surprise to some people. And that's the reason why we don't complain about white privilege. Why are we the most affluent race? Guess what? It comes down to simple choices and economics that determine the possibility of a good and fulfilling and well-paying career over time. I talk about it in terms of education. This is where our stereotype comes into the mix. We study hard, we work hard, we go to good schools, and despite affirmative action plans that have been put into place to keep us or to make the barrier to entry more difficult for Asians, we still get into these schools, we still get good jobs, and we still work hard and hold those jobs. Asians have the most, we're the highest demographic of master's degrees holders and graduate degrees, although I don't necessarily think that advanced and postgraduate education is necessarily key to a successful career. It has something to say with affluence when it comes to economics in this country. Now, when you think about Asians and how we've been able to get ahead, it completely disassembles the whole concept of white privilege. Because here's where it comes into play. Asians, and I'm going to be generalizing here a little bit, but you know what? I'm going to go ahead and do it. I don't care about being politically incorrect. I have witnessed this personally with my own eyes, and it's also something that I perform. If you work hard in this country and you make good choices and you're focused on your goals, you can get ahead here in America.
All right, let's pause right there. While being honest and admitting the history of white supremacy and discriminatory laws in our country, still, he's absolutely right. And the reason I say that is because I'm a firm believer that you can do anything that you put your mind to. Statistically, that doesn't apply to everyone, right? We know everybody wants to be successful, but not everyone will. The other thing is that even in the 1920s, there's always outliers who defy the narrative and are successful. You know, you think of people like Bessie Coleman. You think of people like Ida B. Wells. You think of people like Jack Johnson, who even during the most racist time in America, Jack Johnson, because he really focused on his boxing, was able to have a lot of privileges that most blacks weren't during the Roaring 20s. He was able to stay in luxury hotels. He was able to date white women. And sure, he had angry mobs following him. But what I think the people are trying to say is that even though there is proof that there was discriminatory and racist laws on the books in 1920, Jack Johnson was still able to carve him out a piece of success. So with that being said, I feel like you can apply yourself. But as he admitted, and as most on the far right would admit, we know that this country had a lot of racist laws and racist practices up to the 1960s. So just because Jack Johnson succeeded, that is not fair enough to say that all people can succeed. We know that they couldn't all succeed the way Jack Johnson did or Bessie Coleman did at those times. And we know that's why Bessie Coleman immediately tried to break barriers and open up flight schools for black girls so that then could be demolished and make those opportunities for people. So I agree with him that no matter how racist the country ever was, there's always people that are able to break through, and it has a lot to do with their determination and their willingness to succeed. But that does not disprove white privilege and white supremacy, because again, using Jack Johnson as an example, we know that it was stronger than ever in America at that time, but he still succeeded. So he's right and he's wrong. He's right that proves that yes, you can succeed no matter what, but that does not disprove that there is racism and white privilege. And this is where we got to stop this one size fit all, ones or the others. Let's simplify things. Let's bring out the pie chart. Always the pie chart. You're going to see I'm big with the pie chart. Let's go.
When I talk about culture as it pertains to other races, here's something to keep in mind, because it is one of the biggest socioeconomic indicators that keep people in poverty and from getting above the lower middle class in America. And that has to do with, surprise, having children out of wedlock. It is something that is a choice, that is a cultural thing that is more prevalent in the African American community. Single black motherhood is 70+%. That's not me trying to be insensitive.
No, it's not, and we gotta look past the narratives and acknowledge the facts that what he's saying is true, and that of course statistics can be used to paint many pictures because they're numbers that you paint in meaning to, or you can use to fit your narrative. Definitely, let's bring out the pie chart about the personal choices or actual life circumstances that cause single motherhood. But since he's a conservative, whenever conservatives are trying to bury Democrats and get black people off the plantation, the Democrat plantation, they'll admit to systemic racism. They'll admit to the real instances of shady politics. They'll admit to the shady, predatory tactics of Democrats. But as soon as you try to say it about America or even the right wing, it disappears, it vanishes, it doesn't exist. And I'll give you an example of this. Lots of conservatives are more than quick to illustrate the fact that Planned Parenthood and the welfare system are two things that they primarily claim are Democratic programs, because Democrats mostly support abortions, and they mostly support organizations like Planned Parenthood, and they were the biggest proponents of the welfare state. But we know that the welfare state incentivized black women to not have black men in the household. So this is a government action that was increasing the absent father teism. And if you look historically back through the 1900s and the 1800s, black people had some of the strongest nuclear families in the entire country. Do you understand? And especially because they couldn't marry outside of their race, there was lots of strong black families, and we didn't see that start to change until the late 70s and early 80s. So welfare, they will admit to you, had a devious design to baby the black community and to be their protector and provider in the lieu of a black man. So that's step number one. Of course, Planned Parenthood also further tries to undermine and destroy the black family through abortions and things like that. And then on top of that, we got to talk about the war on drugs. The war on drugs is one of the biggest contributing factors to why in the 1980s, black men disappeared from the black home. Now, I'd like to just also point out the timeline here is that he and all conservatives admit that this country wasn't really fair for black people and other minorities until about 1964, okay? My dad was 1 year old. My father was the first person in my family that was born with equal opportunity, equal rights, voting rights, equal pay, all the great things that he rattled off. My father. So essentially what you're asking black people to do is to close 500 years of wealth disparities in one generation. You want to look at my dad and say, hey, things have been fair since you were 1 year old. How come you're not rich like us? And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind, that people his age and my age, we're really young, and so things seem really simple and, oh yeah, well duh, it's because the fathers aren't. But you have to understand, the country became fair when my father was 1 year old, okay? And then we're fast forwarding straight from there to the 80s. Now my father's, in his 20s and he's about to have his first kids, which is us. And now you've got Planned Parenthood, the welfare state, war on drugs, affirmative action, all these things that are undermining the self-determinism of black communities and black self-determinism. So there's lots of factors that go into that. So let's bring out the pie chart. You've got Planned Parenthood, you've got the war on drugs, you've got the welfare state incentivizing the mothers to be in single households, and then you've got personal choice. Now you can play with those numbers as much as you think. What do you think is responsible? Do you think personal choice is responsible for 30 to 50 and these other factors account for this? I don't care I don't care the size of your slices of pie, but we need to stop using reductionist, simplistic methods to try to make ourselves feel better and make ourselves feel more accomplished or other people feel worse, when honestly, look at the pie chart. These are the factors. You can play with the size of the slices as you want, but you can't just say it's all personal choice. Saying it's all personal choice is just as irresponsible as saying it's all the white man. So let's be honest and bring out the pie chart. Continue.
That is just a fact. And when it comes to whites, it's around 20-something%. With Asians, it's around 15 to 17%. So right there, that already tells you that we are the lowest percentage when it comes to having children out of wedlock. When it comes to dropouts, blacks tend to be the highest percentage when it comes to dropout rates in schools. And this is where I believe that affirmative action does not benefit African Americans. I've already talked about how affirmative action is harmful to minorities. With blacks, why would you lower the standard, the barrier to entry to going to schools? Are you really setting them up for success in the long run? Black dropouts are more prevalent when you have affirmative action in place.
Okay, so I partly agree with him on that. And just like, and this is something that people on the left really need to take from people on the right and understand, is that a lot of these things that you think the Democratic left is being kind of like the white liberal saviors to offer these things to help you, are not really there to help you, honestly. And I absolutely understand all the elders and OGs who lived through extreme employment discrimination eras and extreme times where the schools were separate and not equal, where black people had to go to inferior schools using inferior materials, and a school system that they were immediately ushered into after segregation. I even have problems with segregation. Like, let's not just with anti-segregation, let's just not stop at affirmative action. And then you dump these kids into a white school system where, of course, they're going to be behind, and then you give them standardized testing to make them compete with people who have had the option of reading and literacy and going to great schools since the inception of the school system in the 1800s. It's not really the same thing. Now, to be fair, if he's saying that in today's day and age, most African American children have access to free and public schools, he's absolutely right. And if we want to talk about why the school system fails certain kids, and especially in poor communities of all races, then that's a whole separate conversation. We got to bring out the pie chart on why kids aren't being successful. But he is bringing up a good point that that there's always going to be a factor of personal choice in the matter. Yeah, let me go back and see.
Setting them up for success in the long run. Black dropouts are more prevalent when you have affirmative action in place. And also, it's no different with the workplace. If people are hired based on affirmative action because they are minorities, they're not going to stick around. They're not going to succeed in the workplace.
That's somewhat true, somewhat statistically true. It's tough because my father, when we were moving around in California, he had landlords straight up say, this is in the mid-90s, say, oh, sorry, we're not renting to black people. Very bluntly, my father was turned down on places. So I do agree with him that it's hard to say that there should be something in place that makes people act right. Because you're right, there's lots of little nuances like that escape us. But at the same time, I understand my father's generation would say, well, something needs to be done because racists are being racist. So something you can relate this to is how a lot of people were trying to give Dr. Martin Luther King crap because he supported the president's decision to send bayonet troops to Arkansas to help those girls get into that school. And so just like affirmative action, yes, it sucks that we have to send troops to walk 4 little girls to school. And of course you can get mad at us and say, why do you get troops to take you to school? Unfortunately, it's because there's racist mobs. So when it comes to affirmative action, yes, I agree that that law creates a lot of funny situations. But at the same time, at least in the 90s, underemployment and unfair housing was heavily affecting the black community. So you weren't going to find a lot of black people that complained that people were being forced to treat them fairly.
So when it comes to dropouts, people not finishing high school, forgive me for sounding politically incorrect, but it's still the black community or black population as a whole and a ton of the white demographic as well. Now, Asians only make up about 5% of the United States population. So compared to the amount of people there are in the United States relative to blacks and to whites, we are the minority in that regard. But if
numerically, you are the minority.
I mean, how many Asian dropouts do you know? How many Asians do you know are having children out of wedlock? Now, I'm not saying that they don't. I'm not going to go as far as to say that that is, but it's just not as common. And that leads to...
Bruh. I'm really grateful because I'm from Oakland. Oakland, we got every type of everybody. You know what I'm saying? We got Asian gangsters down here that gets down with the best of them. And living in Oakland has really been beneficial because we're all in this poor community, and I swear to God, there's white, Asian, Polynesian, Latino, Indian, Arabic. We have every race that does everything. Sure, we have scholars in all of those races, but we also got people in the hood in all of those races, and we all share a common struggle, and we all use common language, sometimes including the N-word in some applicable cases. So that's why you're not going to make me see this as a black problem. This is this is about poverty. This is the culture we share in poor communities. Continue.
And that leads to overall affluence in America. The Brookings Institute, as it's referenced by the Daily Wire, by a lot of political commentators.
Now he's giving up his sources, and now I see why his narrative is so in line with an official narrative. And then you've got the far left official narrative, you got the far right official narrative. So when conservatives often say, hey, black people, get off of the Democratic plantation and be a free thinker, but they're not really honoring free thinkers. They're really just saying, hey, come over to our side of the narrative. So really they're just having a narrative war when we all know the truth is in between, right? So let's continue.
Out there have referenced the 3 biggest things that will keep you out of poverty, and the biggest factor is having children out of wedlock. If you have children out of wedlock, that is one thing that prevents you from getting ahead in America.
Pause real quick. Some of that is true, and again, you can bring out the pie chart here because there's almost nothing that he's going to say from the conservative standpoint that doesn't have some truth to it, just like the liberals. What I will challenge him with this, though, is that, for example, my parents had all of their kids in wedlock. You get what I'm saying? And we were still poor, digging ourselves out of generational wealth in a country that he himself admit just became fair when my father was 1. You get what I'm saying? So even though my parents were married and held steady jobs, my dad got his bachelor's, my mom got her master's, we were already in our teens by the time they got their master's. You get what I'm saying? So to say that there are not married couples who are poor and struggling of all races is absolutely not true. You can break out the pie chart and say how many people who are poor are married versus not married, and it may border on the people who are not married, right? And there's factors tied in. So what he's saying has some truth, but it's not a simplified end-all be-all. Let's continue.
And that is especially common in those minority groups and demographics that I mentioned prior. The other 2 things is making sure you don't drop out of high school, that you finish high school, and the other thing, just have a full-time job. If you do those 3 things, those are all as a result of choice, of working hard, and of taking personal accountability and responsibility and getting ahead in America.
To his point, we've already mentioned some factors in some cases where that doesn't apply, but we have to be honest that the school may suck. You may have unfair practices, standardized testing might not be tailored to you, but if everybody in this country of all races only dropped out from school when it was literally stacked to against them, unfair, inappropriate, or whatever case it could be, it probably would only be 30% of the 100% of dropouts. That 30% you can say is dropping out because of extreme cases like having to take on early work for the family, having to be having to stay home while parents are both working. You know, there's a lot of reasons why that 30% could have dropped out of school, and we need to be honest and fair with those numbers. But for that other, in my opinion, it could be 60, 80% of less of people who are dropping out in ways that are preventable. Then there is a conversation to be had there.
It's got nothing to do with race, people. It has everything to do with culture and everything to do with personal responsibility, okay? There are not laws that make it more favorable to whites.
Since the 1960s.
Okay? There are not constructs out there that make it impossible for minorities to get ahead. Because why would Asians be among the most affluent demographic in the United States? Why are they the top income earners? Answer me that.
Good question. Let's go into that. So it seems that Zach has this idea that all minorities have equal struggles, right? And so we're going to break down a few things on the Black versus the Asian experience in America to show you that it's not the same. Now, we all have faced discrimination, we all face certain things, but here are just a few reasons why the comparison he's trying to make of why Indians and Asians don't complain about white privilege and are super affluent and other minorities aren't. Let's really take at the difference between our experiences here. We want to just say that we are for all races and all people coming together despite socioeconomic background, and that we need to stop playing oppression Olympics and gaslighting each other, period, and that we're all guilty of it. Every single race is guilty of it, period. So let's just get that out the way, and then we can go into the fact. Let's look at some of the ways Asians face discrimination in this country. We can talk about, of course, you know, the Chinese Exclusion Act. We can talk about the working conditions and the pay and the interpersonal discrimination they faced in the mine and railroad industries in America. I mean, to compare the Asian and Black experience, despite those things that we just mentioned, you cannot compare them. And then we'll go into why. Asians chose to migrate here, and they migrated here with their own money, and they often saved up money before coming, and they often had family members back home that they would send money back and forth to. They spoke their native tongue and had connections to their home. They could leave anytime they want, and they actually often came out here for work, which means they almost had a job as soon as their feet touched the ground. We also can go into the fact that they weren't barred from literacy, and that that obviously slaves came here without a choice, with zero money. They weren't allowed to speak their native language. They were stopped from reading for hundreds of years. And we can talk about how there was many more massacres and brutalization and lynchings. You know, you don't show me some pictures of Asians being lynched and the trauma that causes people intergenerationally. And then you can go into the fact that there weren't entire Asian communities being burned down because they were prosperous, you know, and the Ku Klux Klan wasn't targeting Asians. They were targeting blacks almost exclusively, and every once in a while some Jews. So even just right there, that is a completely different start to why the generational, and what we're focusing on is the generational wealth. The Asian race, when you look at the eugenic junk science of the late 1800s, you see that the Asiatic races by white people were considered Aryan, and they were high on the evolutionary mark. Blacks and natives were low. So white people did not see Asians as these lower tier 3/5 human people. Sure, they related them to mongrels. Sure, they called them racist names, but their science did not include all of that racist stuff towards Asians. Okay. So that's the other thing. And then when we're talking about that anyway, we might as well go into the fact that what he's saying is that now he's talking very classic conservative points. He's saying that all of black people's problems are because they have children out of wedlock, that they don't finish high school, and that they don't work. They don't have jobs. So this is easily destroyed. But this is also shared by a lot of conservatives. So I don't want to make it seem like this is Asians hating black people. This is just regular conservative talking points here. But let's really look at it, okay? So after 500 years of non-deniable racism, institutionalism, and brutality, we're saying that black people have had the last 50 years to catch up with everyone else, right? If you look around and you see the household medium of white and Asian families, well, let's go ahead and rewind back that we've had one generation at a fair shot. Well, two at this point. We've had the generation of the 60s, and then some of them had kids in their 20s / early 30s, and that brings us to my generation. We've had two generations at a fair shot while they've always had the ability to send money back and forth. You have to understand that black people in America were completely cut off from Africa. We weren't allowed to go back. We lost that language. Our grandpas can't send us money back in the States when we need it. We can't earn a bunch of money and send it to our grandpas in Africa. It doesn't work like that. So again, the experience is very unrelatable. It's not to say that Asians didn't come out in large numbers for civil rights, so they shouldn't partake in them. I think black people did a great service by making sure this country lived up to its creed for all people. So when conservatives immediately brag and say, 1964, this became a fair country, to say, oh, look, we have rights and you guys aren't taking advantage of them, it's kind of disrespectful. Okay, if you're trying to make the case that, oh yeah, black people experience interpersonal racism, but not institutional racism, let me go ask the Asians in America in 2020 which one they would rather deal with. You get what I'm saying? Violence, aggression, rhetoric, gaslighting, and being treated unfairly and violently, or a discriminatory law that says they can't vote. Which one would they like more? Which one feels better? Do you feel like when a lot of really vicious people are coming at Asians saying, go back to your country, you brought this disease here, and all this xenophobia, do you feel like there is no hate against you? Do you feel like you're not judged by people who think they belong here and you don't? So obviously violence against anybody is bad, but I think especially during this Asian hate campaign, it's a good time to pose these questions back to him, especially Joe Biden. Well, not just Joe Biden, but for a long time, people have been trying to, they're kind of making it harder for Asians to advance in certain schools because obviously Asians are outperforming their white counterparts as well. So we've seen liberal white governments, again, this government is not black run. They're either conservative whites or liberal whites. They are kind of discriminating against Asians. Do you think that's a form of institutional racism where a government official is saying that Asians can't apply or can't go to this school in this many numbers? We have to limit them and stagger their success so that our race can catch up. Is that not institutionally racist to Asians? Is it okay because they're white liberals? You get what I'm saying? So that is not to dismantle his point completely, because we know with the pie chart that some of what he's saying is true. Some of it is personal choice. And then he didn't specifically mention this in its words, but the black victimhood mentality also is something that we need to address. Again, we don't need white people or Asian people to tell us how to deal with our problems. What would be supportive is to deal with the parts of the problems that you're directly involved in. For example, the Chinese, the Asian community has had a very close, supportive, loving, but also somewhat of a parasitic relationship in black communities. We know that in poor black communities, there are lots of Asian-owned businesses that specifically target blacks' needs, and they don't hire blacks, they don't give to blacks, they don't. If 90% of your customers are black and 0% of your employees are black, you have to admit that Asian people have made a lot of money off of the poor African Americans in this, and that's not to blame them specifically, because the same thing with liquor stores and corner stores who are owned by the people in the Arab community. So I think before anybody in these communities try to gaslight blacks, you have to understand that a lot of your civil rights came from blacks and the black struggle. A lot of your money and current business opportunities come directly from black people. Most Chinatowns are closer to poor black areas than affluent white areas. Do you understand? So that's what I'll go ahead and wrap up this video with. Is I just wanted, as Jake, he gave all of his points very articulately and with a lot of confidence. But as you can see by my rebuttal, it's not as simple as they're trying to make it, and there is a discussion to be had. So when you see somebody talk like this, just like Ben Shapiro and them, don't say, oh, they sounded so confident, it must be right. Now I can take these talking points and repeat them in black people's face or in other people's face or poor people's face. Don't just do that, because it's not that simple, and anybody with a deeper understanding can break things down.
You are responsible for your own decisions, and that's what I want to leave you with today.
We Asian Americans have weaponized our proximity to whiteness because of our individual actions and our collective inaction. We can't just blame white people for pitting us against each other either, because the fact of the matter is that Asian cultures have a huge colorism problem and a huge problem with black people. Our model minority status given to us by white people is somewhat of a privilege. It means we don't get racially profiled by the police and that we can walk freely without someone calling the cops on us. For the most part, we're seen as non-threatening. However, as seen with COVID, our privilege is conditional. I said this in my COVID video, but there are so many Asian American people who for the first time were saying America is so racist and racism against Asian people in the US has been reawoken. Like, I don't think it was ever asleep. But that just goes to show how much white people have made us feel comfortable at the expense of black people. White people only treat Asian Americans better than black people, so we don't realize that they're full human beings, so that white people can create this culture war between us, so we Asian Americans don't empathize with their plight. I now want to answer this very complex question, and that is, why is it so hard for Asian Americans to talk about how they take part in anti-black racism? I think the main reason is that there's a lot of resentment between the black and Asian communities. We've hurt each other, but only one of us has benefited from white supremacy.
All right. And in closing, one of the last issues I want to bring up, since it's super relevant to the issues that have been escalating in the Asian community since the pandemic, is in the rise of violence. Of course, we see all races perpetrating, but we also see a lot of black on Asian attacks. And so some people were looking into this issue and wondering why that is. Now, obviously, hateful rhetoric affects everyone and kind of spices everyone up. One of the things I encourage people to look at is that Chinatowns, Koreatowns, and other Asian communities are usually in close proximity to poor black communities. So not every case is a racially motivated case. Sometimes when there's violence between black and Asians, just like black on black crime, it has a lot to do with proximity. Just look how racist it would be if blacks were living in this community with all these other races and they exclusively killed 100% of themselves. And how racist would that be for the rest of the world? Is as long as black people are killing each other in the neighborhood, it's fine. It's not a big conversation. But as soon as they kill a member of any other race, then all of a sudden it's this big national tragedy that we need to focus on. So I completely agree that it was painful to see black on Asian crime, especially since we share a lot of the same communities and business areas. But just keep those incidences in mind in national context and not try to single it out as something different or especially heinous. We'd like to think that black people are more sensitive or more just because of what they've gone through, but the truth is we're all just people and we're going through the same things. And so it's just another reminder for all of us to be sensitive to each other's struggles. When people say stop Asian hate, it would be inappropriate to reply with stop all hate, because that would be insensitive to what's currently going on in the Asian community. But that also extends to the black community. With that being said, peace, love, and prosperity to everybody in the struggle. Whether you're a person of color, poor, white, or a woman. Every single person on this planet deals with their own struggles and their own trials and tribulations, and we just need to do our best to support each other as individuals and not depend on the government to make us treat each other right. We gotta stay focused on the common enemy, which is a system, not a person. I'm Freedom Reign, the man in the middle, the destroyer of narratives, and one of the greatest American citizens of all time. Thanks for watching this video. Be sure to check out other reactions and the Hidden History series. And remember, Carthage must be restored. Peace!